Welcome back, everyone, from across all time zones. I'm Oancea from the University of Oxford, and I am honoured to facilitate this panel session. We'll start with opening statements from each of the panelists and then move into discussion. And to contribute to discussion, may I remind to please post questions and comments in the chat during the talks, and I will follow the chat and invite you to ask your questions live, at which point please remember to turn on your camera and microphone. Now, this panel brings together colleagues who, between them, have written and spoken compellingly and critically about knowledge hegemonies, centres and peripheries, academic politics, circuits of prestige, social contestation and troubled consensus, and the limits and performative implications of northern theories of globalization. They have also explored the creative possibilities for more just, rounder and deeper knowledge arising from southern and post-colonial theories, from indigenous worldviews and from counter-hegemonic initiatives. And they've also explored the possibilities for more balanced dynamics of multiple knowledge formations in relation to global structures of wealth and power. I am therefore delighted to welcome the panelists for this session. We will start with Crain, Soudien, the former Chief Executive Officer of the Human Sciences Research Council, a joint professor in education and African studies, and formerly a Deputy Vice Chancellor at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Afterwards, we will move to Xin Xu, Research Fellow at the Department of Education, University of Oxford, UK, Junior Research Fellow at Kellogg College, and Centre for Global Higher Education Research Fellow on Project 3, the role of research and research assessment in higher education. Followed by Fernanda Beigel, Principal Researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research, Argentina, Head Professor at the National University of Cuyo, and involved in various initiatives, including FOLEC, the Latin American Forum on Research Evaluation. And finally, we will have a pre-recorded intervention, given the time zone difference, from Raewyn Connell, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney, Australia, and life member of the National Tertiary Education Union. So over to you, Crain, to start us off.
Great. Thanks very much, Alice, and thank you, colleagues. So I'm going to talk, and can we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk essentially about the politics of this work that we do. And in this talk, I'm going to try and open up a discussion about how we sustain what my colleague Catherine Adora Hoppers of South Africa and Uganda calls sustainable epistemic practices, sustainable cross-border praxis in the university. And what she means by that is essentially practices which are able to transcend the dominant politics of epistemic politics of the institutions in which we find ourselves. To open up this discussion, I draw on Bonnie Honig, whom many colleagues will know about, who's written about the idea of what she calls holding cultures. Building on Honig, Lovisa Bergdahl and Elisabeth Langman have explored how you might sustain cultures. And I'll say a little bit about that. I also have at the back of my mind, and I don't refer to this in any kind of detail, but a colleague Howard Richards' discussion of culture in sustaining dominance. I simply make the point here that the insight he brings to this discussion is that it's not just economics which is responsible for dominance, it's what he calls cultures. Thanks. The next slide, please. So what I'm doing here, colleagues, in starting this conversation is giving you a sense of the kinds of initiatives that are cross-border practices or praxis around the world. I started building this map here through a conversation with a number of colleagues in the networks in which I find myself. And it's really just a kicking off point. I mean, what I'd really appreciate is if colleagues know about disruptive initiatives that they might be aware of, and could talk to me about them. Because I really, now having started this, would like to build a map of the kinds of things that are going on around the world, only to emphasize the point, as some of these colleagues do, that another world is possible, that it is possible for us to operate outside of the confines of dominance as we have them in the major accountability systems that are operative in our higher education systems around the world. Thanks. Next slide. In this slide, I having spoken to you about alternatives existing, make the point that these alternatives, however, find themselves in a variety of states of health. They aren't all successful. And a very sad example of initiative which has succumbed to all of this is the Marcus Garvey Institute in Uganda. This institute was started by Danny Nabudere, a really important Africanist who passed away about 4 or 5 years ago. And it's collapsed essentially because it's not been able to find particularly the financial resources to be able to sustain itself. But many of these other examples also that I refer to and point out to in that map are teetering. They're fragile. They're under threat. Some, however, have been able to continue strategically. And the example of the peace program at Earlham College, Indiana, which I have there, is really crucial. And it's crucial because it has been able to appoint presidents who've put their full backbones behind these initiatives. But my conclusion in thinking about the state of these institutions is that none of them stand in full confidence of being able to reproduce themselves. All of them are vulnerable in one way or another. But before I move off the slide, I also need to say that outside of these institutions, and it's important to recognize this, and it came up in an earlier session today, was the identification of individuals inside of institutions. Individuals who are running individual programs, teaching on particular courses, and who've been able to keep these courses going. But even these individuals, as I discovered the other day, particularly if you're a junior scholar, feel the constant threat of surveillance and particularly the suggestion that they aren't doing what is described as proper work. Next slide, please. So what are the approaches that are suggested by the colleagues of which I spoke about earlier, Honig, Beigel and Langman and Richards? Essentially what they're beginning to develop here, and it's important for me to say that we have a new literature emerging here around how emerging or disruptive discussions can be sustained inside of the university. This discussion follows on the track of a really important, bigger discussion that is taking place on what democracy actually means. And in that discussion, there's a really important critique of of dominant forms of democracy around the world, and the argument that we need to begin working towards what is called agonistic forms of democracy, democracies that are difficult and conflictually structured in themselves, but seek to work through those conflicts. Now, Honig is important here as an example. And so she argues for the necessity of building collectivities around these initiatives, building alliances, which she suggests may take us to better states of health. An important nuance which she has in a conversation is about how to elevate, how to sustain what she calls catachresis. Now, catachresis here is that in our world of knowledge, a world of behavior, which is patently wrong, which isn't and doesn't meet the standards of normative behavior. And she argues that a really important tactic here is to try and normalize what is wrong, to bring it into the order in which people find themselves. Beigel and Langman are really useful. They push the Honig idea, and they talk about building what they call pedagogical publics. And what they mean by that is taking issues of concern, like climate change, and now climate change, I think, is a really important one, and elevating that to a public discussion, and through that, exploring what kinds of strategies one might need to develop to keep that conversation as a common concern going. Strategically, they make the point about balancing between what they call urgency and hesitation all the time, action and inaction. In other words, looking to when you need to back off, when you need to go on the offense, and to manage that process very carefully. As I've said, Richard's contribution, Howard Richards, is essentially about confronting the reality that we are sitting with embedded cultures which are not easy to dislodge. His point is about bringing to the fore the importance of alternative cultural values and helping everybody in the discussion come to understand the disjunct or the conflict between alternative cultural values and everyday practices in our institutions. My last slide, please. So this last slide here, colleagues, is essentially about, and it's a much bigger discussion about theories of change. You don't see it clearly in the diagram here, but there's a blue line which I've drawn down the middle there, and that blue line separates these two poles of practices that emerge in working with these approaches that come out of Honig, Beigel, and Langman. And they are the poles of essentially trying to change the environments in which we find ourselves, as opposed to, on the right-hand side, eliminating them. Complete revolution, starting over. On the left-hand side, in the reform side, we have there three prevailing approaches which one can see in a whole lot of the examples which I'd earlier drawn attention to on that map, where these different practices or praxes are in evidence in the ways in which these colleagues behind these initiatives are working. A big one, of course, is internal dialogue, where people, and this you see in many places around the world, are stoking, are provoking internal dialogue inside of the institutions to keep the initiatives going. Some of our colleagues are very much more, I suppose, strategic and tactical, and and are asking us to think of ways of how you kind of infiltrate the dominant institutions of the day and begin to take positions of influence in those institutions. An example I thought was evident in Adam Habib's presentation earlier today. The example is essentially infiltrating, trying to introduce ideas into the institution in ways which disrupt them. The third, and one which again is pretty common around the world, is outright contestation, is when issues are raised to go on the offensive and to contest. But in this literature also, on the right-hand side of my boundary here, I have colleagues who approach what they do with no faith whatsoever in systems of dominance. And I'm making the argument that the only way in which we are going to be able to build an alternative world is by starting all over, by beginning brand new, because the existing system is so contaminated, is so toxic, that to imagine that you could reform it is a pipe dream. And so for them, abolition is absolutely crucial. But what we have here, colleagues, and with this I hope I close, is an emerging discussion about theories of change. And it's really important to be thinking here about the reality that I think that our theories of change are in deep trouble in the world right now. We don't have blueprints as we may have had maybe 20, 30 years ago. We don't have formula. You know, it's not the working class in these formula which is going to systematically upend the system and introduce us to new ways of doing things. It's a whole lot more complicated. I'm closing by saying that we're in the midst of all of this complexity here now, and we must talk about how we hold on to the gains that are being made, that are evident around the world. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Crain, for a strong and thoughtful opening to the panel. And I'm going to invite now Shin to make her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Alice, and thank you to all speakers today. It is such a privilege to engage with this conversation with this amazing panel. And I'm going to share my slides. I hope you can see it. So, so in the next 8 or 9 minutes or so, I'll briefly reflect on the epistemic diversity and inequity in global research. It will draw on some of the previous writings and reflections, but I've been very grateful for the continuing conversations with friends and colleagues and collaborators and the critical scholarship that these issues are grounded. So firstly, I approach the notion epistemic diversity as both the existence of a diversity of knowledge, or rather knowledges, and the recognition of and respect for such diversity. So why is diversity important? As many and as Soudien argues, it allows for different hermeneutical horizons of experience and reservoirs of knowledge to inform scientific collaborations of production. In global research, epistemic diversity exists, but not yet in the full terms. So for instance, global research is open and shared, and there are multiple languages, cultures, ontologies, epistemologies, agendas, paradigms, etc. But it also consists of open networks and invisible colleges, and different people can collaborate and connect beyond visible and invisible borders, including the national borders, but beyond the national borders. The worldwide growth of internationally co-authored publications is one example, although please note the limitations of the Elsevier database here that I will come back to very soon. And despite diversity, there's also epistemic homogeneity, hierarchy, inequity, and injustice. The global research space includes not only knowledge and agents, but also power. And in the Foucauldian terms, knowledge and power are intimately associated with each other. Here, the power acts not only on knowledge and agents as coercive force, but through knowledge. The capillary power pervades and circulates through the entire social bodies and define what counts as knowledge. So in global research, power acts in hegemonic forms, which privilege certain cultural forms and epistemic traditions at different facets, including, as I listed here, the structure, knowledge, and agents. Some of the most visible examples are about representation and participation. For instance, scholarly indexes. There has been numerous research demonstrating the limitations of coverage and the implications of the verb of science and scopus. And even if we're using a more comprehensive database, such as the ORISH database here, we can see a domination of English language academic journals, and among them, again, a domination of English language journals that are indexed by Verb of Science journal citation reports. Note that in many contexts, Verb of Science and Scopus have symbolic values that are equivalent to being of high quality, being international, being accessible, despite this being challenged by many scholarly research already. And if looking at the most representative publishers for those journals, we're again, unsurprisingly, seeing the domination of European publishers. And in terms of ethnicity and racial aspects, one can argue that global research space is far from racially equal. And in terms of gender, despite large diversity in different parts of the world, at the world level, only 1/3 of researchers are women. The participation and representation are only the tip of the iceberg. What is important is that they continue to divide and reproduce the domination. So in the ocean of global knowledge, there are divides about inclusion and exclusion, which brings us to the question that which knowledge are count as global knowledge, and also who has the power to make such decisions and judgments. For instance, for non-Anglo-European cultures, indigenous knowledge and knowledge agents from disadvantaged groups, their knowledge continues to be excluded from the legitimated scholarly indexes, marginalized by research funding and policy, ignored in citations and uses, exploited in collaborations, and lost in translations because they're not in English, not seen or not read, not trusted by people, not because of the knowledge itself, but simply because of who they are. And this happens not only in the arts and humanities and social sciences, but in all fields. One small example is what Trish also mentioned in the keynote this morning, that the research and social experiences of COVID from Asia have not been engaged much in the West, despite this COVID being a global pandemic that affecting all human beings. And arguably, the domination of certain power and consequent epistemic injustice as relevant to epistemic positioning are intersectional. So there are different forms of domination. For instance, the domination of so-called the West, global North, centers, Anglo-European countries and cultures and systems, and the new imperialism, new coloniality, the global whiteness and racism, academic capitalism, neoliberalism, the domination of English language, the patriarchy and sexism, scienticism, and other forms of discriminations, including ableism, ageism, and homophobia, etc. So unfortunately, the list in reality is longer than this, and those hegemonic power are intertwined. When looking through the lens of intersectionality, this means that because people as individuals and as collectives all have many multiple identities at the same time, one can face multiple layers of discriminations or experience some kinds of privilege and some kinds of injustice at the same time. For example, in our research about international academics in China, our participants have shared their experiences of being positioned as more capable knowers or quote-unquote talents, partly because of them being seen as white, But at the same time, women international academics also face structural injustice and microaggressions because of being women within a patriarchal institutional culture. So if we map those hegemonic powers against the different layers listed on the right-hand side of this page, one can find endless examples of epistemic injustice. And challenging those injustices, there have been a wealth of scholarships that engage with perspectives such as decolonization, postmodernism, critical race theory, and feminism, etc. Nonetheless, academic voices from the non-dominating spaces often again risk being marginalized, ignored, and appropriated, demonstrating yet another layer of epistemic injustice. There are many reasons behind the recycling of power domination. For instance, it can be a lack of respect for differences and an abyssal thinking mode that Santos pointed out. It can be a sense of supremacy and entitlement, and also a lack of humbleness to learn from each other. As Beigel from our panel today also has argued, the mainstream has been self-built on the supposition that outside there is backwardness and a lack of academic value. Or it can be restrained by one's own vision, experiences, imagination of how to understand the outside world. As Taoist Zhuangzi put it, you cannot talk about the sea with a frog who lives in the well, who has no idea about the outside space. You cannot talk about ice with an insect of summer who only knows nothing beyond its own season. And the consequences are, just to paraphrase The Sound of Silence, people can be hearing without listening, talking without communicating, writing without conveying, and reading without understanding. But is there no way out of this? Well, there are, and there should be. Academically, some scholars propose radical agendas to transcend predominant epistemologies, and some suggest moderate proposals to bring in new perspectives while scrutinizing the predominant knowledges without abandoning them. And Santos suggests an ecology of knowledges, which suggests radical co-presence of different knowledges. And fruitful mutual learning also grow out of ethical grounds that are nurtured with intellectual humbleness, intellectual humility, as Alice also highlights, and mutual respect and an open mindset. So there are, of course, many more actions and many more ways to move forward, and many more actions that are taken and to be taken in daily practices by institutions and with communities. I won't be able to talk about them due to the time limitation, but I very much welcome discussions and dialogues, because coming back to the first point about global research, it is, after all, open, collective, and shared by all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shane, for your sharp and really insightful statement as well. So Fernanda, I'm extending the invitation to you now, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to see if I'm good with the presentation now. Let's see. Is it okay?
Yes, I can see your presentation, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation and this excellent panel. I'm very interested in all that has been said until now. And what I brought here today on this title of the circulation of knowledge beyond the mainstream landscape is regarding the discussion that we could make on the differences between the mainstream, between the mainstream and what has been traditionally called the periphery or the peripheral science. I think that in the critiques from the North and in the critiques from the South, the global South also, there is a belief and a complete conviction that a complete argument that we have mainstream science as a hierarchical type of science, which is normally understood as something that as knowledge that is original, that is really transparent and universal. And in the down part of this scheme, you can see the peripheral science, which is normally understood as something marginal, mostly imitative or not original. And to the left, you can see an arrow that is going down, because we have seen, and there is evidence for this, that in the global south, the global standards have marked very deeply our research assessment systems. And so the idea of academic excellence has been built in the north, and that is a fact. And in many universities and research groups in the south, it's been a tendency to try to grow in the direction of the north. However, in this scheme, I'm just presenting the discussions in order for you to see how one of these national academic fields looks like in the global south, in this case, the Argentinian case, which is my country. And what I'm trying to show here is that the reality is a lot more complex than this. It's a lot more complex than the old concept of academic dependency that we've been discussing for the last 20 years, or maybe 50 years, because we've had like previous concepts on this in the discussion since the 50s and the 60s. So in this scheme, I'm just trying to present the discussion that we do have indeed a hierarchy that is marked by this idea of mainstream science, the reports that are based on data sources such as Web of Science or Scopus, but we also have other realities. And this takes me to one of the main issues, and with this lack of time, I'm going to maybe put the stress in the language asymmetries and the language issue. It is confirmed, and we have a lot of evidence to say, that in Web of Science, in Scopus, in all the mainstream type of databases and reports based, observations based on these reports, it is true that English is hypercentral in the discussions. We are speaking English today, but my question is if that is the unique reality, and I have a lot of evidence to prove that this is not the unique reality in publishing nor in the research agendas in the global scale. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have an academic circuit, not only in academic exchange, but also in a very strong publishing circuit, that if you can go back to the intellectual Latin American space, maybe you can talk about an intellectual space of more than 200 years of existence. But in the last 60 years, since the 1950s, 1960s, this region emerged as a publishing circuit with its own indexing systems. And you can see here, Redalix, Cielo, Latindex, and Biblat. And we have more than 700 diamond type of journals. This is the main feature of the communication, scientific communication in Latin America. And so this Latin American circuit is developed, as you can see here, from the 1950s. We have a publishing industry that is very dynamical also in the region. I'm going to go a bit faster here. We have La Referencia, which is a federation of repositories. And so we are indeed in the avant-garde of open access and open science. This is very important because the open access movement and open science has changed lately the whole landscape of circulation of knowledge in many ways. In a very negative way, I think Europe is in the avant-garde of this. Open access has been converted into the transition to a more commercial publishing industry, with charging the authors for publishing, and this particularly is really a rough situation for the non-hegemonic countries, in which our scientists have to pay for these publications. Well, in the north, the agreements of freedom publishing are growing in the universities that have the power, the economic power to pay for that. But if you go to the language balance in our repositories and our journals, you will see that of the more than 3 million documents that La Referencia harvests, we have 1,255,000 articles, and the presence of Portuguese is very important here. We have 531,000 articles in this language, We have in Spanish 367,000 and in English a very similar amount. Here, and I'm not going to develop on this, in red you can compare the amount of articles that you have in Scopus Web of Science and in these Latin American repositories and databases. And you can see that we have, of course, a lot more published articles in, and here's only articles, right, in our own index and databases. So the question we always make in Latin America is, why don't we, can't we make more visible our production, and what is the problem in which there is a technical problem in which we cannot observe all this in a regional platform, interoperable platform in which we could see all of this, because all this that I'm describing has overlappings. And so that's one of our main challenges in Latin America. And the other question is, what about English? Because we do have an important portion of English production in our own journals. This is a collection of a database that reunites Cielo and Redalic. English has a 23% of these articles. And this is attributed mostly to the Brazilian case, because in Brazil, we can see indeed that we have a sustained growth of the English articles and journals since 2009 until now. And so what actions should we stimulate from Latin America and the Global South in general to boost multilingualism and bibliodiversity if we agree that this exists and we have to boost these type of alternative circuits? First of all, I think we have to change the evaluation systems. The research assessment systems are really critical here. We have to open the discussion on the quality of national journals, usually identified as endogamy, and to promote translation policies. In Latin America, we're starting to see journals that are multilingual. This is not that they publish in many languages, but that they do publish each article in 2 or 3 languages in a translation. And so I think that the other and the final action that we need is to provide financial support for Diamond University journals. And that's all for now in my 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernanda, for this important critical contribution as well. We now have a intervention from Raewyn and Connell, and that is pre-recorded because of the time zone difference. So I'm going to ask our colleagues to show us the video. And in the meantime, please continue to post questions and comments for the discussion that will start immediately after the video.
Well, greetings from Sydney in Australia on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. I hope the meeting is going well, and here's my 2 bobs worth. I want to start by talking about what I call the research-based knowledge formation, which is the basic organization of knowledge in the disciplinary knowledge system that's dominant in higher education in practically all parts of the world. It's the organization of knowledge that we see in the mainstream curriculum, in applied sciences, as well as the pure science disciplines, science and humanities. It's what we see in the Web of Science, in the conventional databases. And of course, therefore, it's the basis of rankings and all of the institutional apparatus of the neoliberal university world that we all know and love so well. Now, I call this the research-based knowledge formation. By knowledge formation, I mean something more than an episteme, something more than simply a formation of ideas. I mean basically an episteme in practice, as it's materialized in the world, as it's realized in knowledge institutions like universities, museums, botanic gardens, research institutes and the like. As it's materialized in a workforce, and that is very important to what I want to say, that there is a workforce, a fairly complex workforce that makes these institutions operate, not just the academics, not just the scientists, but all of the other workers who make these institutions function, and a set of practices through which knowledge is circulated and taught, and above all, through which knowledge grows, because all knowledge formations, including the research-based one, do have mechanisms for growth and adaptation to their situations. Now, I would argue that the knowledge formation that's hegemonic in the global university system is not well understood if we call it Western knowledge, although that is quite common in decolonial, anti-colonial discourses. I would argue that the dominant knowledge formation was historically formed in empire, in the 500 years or so of European overseas and overland imperial expansion, and then the post-imperial period of neo-empire that we're living in today. And that this knowledge formation has been characterized from very early by a global division of labor, in which the colonized world functions mainly as a gigantic data mine, and the imperial center, the metropole, serves as the site of processing, accumulation of knowledge and theory. I want to illustrate this from biological science with a picture from the early 19th century, illustrating one of the great works of perhaps the man who was perhaps the single most influential scientist of that first half of the 19th century, Alexander von Humboldt, one of the founders of climate science, a major figure in botanical science and so forth. This is a picture derived from his research in South America in his youthful days, where he produced one of the very early attempts at what we might now call biogeography, that is studying the geographical and climatic distribution of plants. This is a kind of schematic cross-section of South America with the Andes in the middle, Pacific and Atlantic Oceans on the sides, and the habitat of different species of plants graphed against the height and distance from the sea. This is absolutely characteristic, not just of biological science, but of many other forms of natural science, and of course of the social sciences too, which drew massively on the knowledge dividend of empire, as we might now think of it. I call the trade in knowledge and the set of arrangements around this global flow and inequality of knowledge, the global economy of knowledge. I haven't got time to go into that now, but I have described it in rather more detail in one of the chapters of this book, if you'll excuse the advertisement. But I want to go on now to reflect on some of the dynamics of imperial power, which is manifest in the global economy of knowledge that was formed in the construction and development of global empire. It was characteristic of the culture of global imperialism that some forms of knowledge were exalted, especially that patronized by the elite knowledge institutions of what we might now call the global north, while other patterns of knowledge, other languages, conceptual languages and so forth, were subordinated or incorporated sometimes in a subordinate position within the mainstream knowledge formation, but others indeed were excluded. And that is something that the current debates about knowledge on a global scale have become very explicit about. And I want to expand a little bit on that that argument by suggesting there are at least 4 kinds of knowledge formation, in that sense of an episteme in practice, which were substantially excluded from the research-based knowledge formation, hence from curricula that are based on it. They include indigenous knowledges, the kind we're now increasingly familiar with in regard to the Americas, to Australia, to the Pacific. Alternative universalism, so that forms such as forms of knowledge that grew up in Islamic culture, Islamic jurisprudence, for instance. Specific local knowledges, often connected with the occupations or local economies, and the pattern of knowledge that I've called Southern theory, which is the, at least in the social sciences, the contributions to knowledge and the forms of thinking that arise in colonial society in reaction to colonization and the power structure and inequalities of empire. Now, those patterns of knowledge tended to be excluded from dominant curricula, from the dominant knowledge formation from early on. And yet I would argue that in our time, in the early 21st century, the Common Era, higher education has actually become more resistant, not less resistant, not more welcoming, but more resistant as a result of changes in the management of universities, the pattern of funding of universities, where public tax-based funding has declined sharply in importance, and funding through fees has risen in importance. Through the operation of league tables, competition for fee-paying students, in which hierarchies within the dominant knowledge formation are important advertising points. And of course, as a result of the political suspicion of universities by right-wing and authoritarian regimes all around the world. So we're not necessarily moving towards a resolution of the inequalities and exclusions that have characterized higher education in the past, and have still characterized it in the period when it's grown on a massive scale globally. My argument then, the point that I want to finish with, basically, is that epistemic change can't really happen without institutional change. Change in the knowledge formation requires change in the economy and institutional patterns that underlie it. And to many people in higher education, this just seems impossible. They find it very difficult to think outside the framework of the institutional apparatus that we've now got. And to persuade people that it is possible, I think it's quite important that we recognize and celebrate and document what I would call the other history of higher education. That is the history of institutions that are actually built in other knowledge formations or substantial material from other knowledge formations to change dominant curricula and research agendas. So to give a very quick example of this, Visva Bharati, the college set up by Rabindranath Tagore in Bengal just 100 years ago. This is its opening ceremony, which was meant in his mind as, or his language, as a place for the meeting of civilizations, not simply reproducing the curricula of the British Rajas universities, but opening to Asian-based knowledge formations as well. We need to think about the history of Islamic higher education institutions. Here's a picture of Al-Azhar as in Cairo, as it was before the modernization undertaken by the Nasser regime, 1950s and 60s. And we have here a whole, culture area of universities, in fact, which have experience in the mingling or meeting of different knowledge formations. We should be paying attention to institutions like CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, which is in Dakar, and has an excellent online website, and is very much concerned with the interplay of knowledge formations across Africa. Groups like RUICE, the network of indigenous, intercultural and community universities in Central America, which is hardly known in the Anglosphere, but is an important attempt at linking across national borders this agenda of opening out the knowledge formation to other forms of knowledge and including other cultures. That's my argument, that we need institutional change, that we have a history that points to the possibility of radical change in higher education now. So I hope your discussions go well from here on. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Best of luck.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for sharing the video, and also many thanks to Raewyn for sending us the pre-recorded contribution. So we've got now around 10 minutes for discussion and comments. And I will start by summarizing a comment that is in the chat from Angela, where I think now it's in the early hours of the morning, so I will read it out for you. So the comment is around the fact that in particularly in low income, low economic countries, organic knowledge is maybe deemed marginal, whilst dominant knowledges may be influencing domestic policies, development agendas, and different other practices, but with outcomes which often are not practical, irrelevant in the local context, and which may be time-consuming and expensive. I think the question is if you would like anyone on the panel to comment on the ways in which dominant knowledges fail to integrate into local and social cultural values. I can't see, okay, I can see Crain now as well. So I can invite, or if you would like to offer, that'd be great.
Well, maybe I can just say a word. I think that it's not exactly that dominant knowledge is like in a completely separated world from the local and the local knowledge. In the empirical studies that we've made on Argentina, Chile, or Brazil, the cases that I know, the research agendas that you can see from the perspective of, for example, the mainstream publishing seems like completely separated, completely segmented. But when you look at the complete trajectory of a researcher in the non-hegemonic countries like ours, things are different because you find the people, for example, in one complete trajectory of a researcher in the social sciences in Argentina, you can see that there is a bet to work in the research agendas from the international debates, but there are also many other types of exchange that are being made with a local agenda. So I see more researchers with a multi-scalar type of agenda than scholars, uniquely directed to the mainstream agenda. I don't know if it was clear. I was trying to make a synthesis of my thinking.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. If Crain or Shin would like to comment on this, please signal. Otherwise, I will invite 2 other comments. Okay, Crain?
Well, just to say that I think building this binary is not a practice that we should be encouraging. And so even the analytic frames that we use here, we should try to be looking at the complexities of it a whole lot more, because there are elements of this dominant knowledge which gets incorporated into these spaces that has value. A lot of it, yes, is in its imposition problematic. But we need languages which are a little more complicated, a little more nuanced in how we come to understand how these things work. And it's in that vein of saying that also that not all these other forms of knowledge are in themselves also good. There are many things about these other forms of knowledge that we ought to be critical about too. So it's developing postures of criticality which are open to looking at everything, but also taking the position that nothing anywhere is by itself complete and comprehensive.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite now two questions, one by Victoria and the second by Altaf Kadir. So if you would like to turn your microphone and camera on, Victoria.
Hello, nice to meet you, and congratulations for this excellent session. First of all, it is a need of stability in science. Secondly, it is a huge pressure of dynamics in knowledge. How to reform the academic norms, assuming dominant knowledge in current culture of diversity? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And I'll also take the question by Altaf Kadir.
Hi, my name is Altaf. I'm reaching you from Canada. My question, you have presented very well, and I'm very impressed. And now you have brought various dimensions of various challenges that we are facing. I'm considering if there are various types of environments and various types of connections, how we can bring multiple dimensions of environments together. So normally we are highlighting physical environment. Can we also talk about cognitive environment, social environment, languages environment, and bring the multiple perspective together to enrich our efforts for all stakeholders in the world?
Thank you very much. Who would like to start?
Okay, I'll make a comment. Thanks for that last comment, Altaf. I think, and my response in terms of just the way in which I've been speaking, you could probably predict. So I'm going to say that we need to try these things out. And it's really important to be looking at cases where initiatives, interventions have tried what you've described. And for us to understand empirically what's going on inside of those environments and those contexts. Now, those environments, of course, can't be universalized and so easily. And so you can't take a model which might work in a particular place and bring it back to another place and say, use that here, it worked there. I mean, the whole ecology is really an important thing to be thinking about and understanding. But you've got to try things out, and we have to speak or stimulate a conversation about these different approaches that are being explored in different parts of the world. And we will begin to learn, I think, a little bit more about how the particular might help us to understand the universal, and not from the universal to the particular, to really come to acknowledge the fact that we are different in multiple kinds of ways. And I love your distinction of the cognitive, because that's as a feature of our very structuralist types of conversations, is not a feature of much of what we speak about. So it's these multiple differences that need to come into play, I think, that are absolutely critical in understanding how we might move. Thanks, Alice.
Thank you very much, Crain. Shin, would you like to come in as well?
Thank you, and thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Alta, for your really good questions. So for the question about changing academic norms, I very much agree with what has been also presented and discussed on this panel, such as by Fernanda about the changing academic evaluations and also infrastructures, and also like strengthening and reinforcing the local agency. So those are some of the concrete like actions one can take. And also I would like to say that maybe this is an invitation to everyone, because I've been using some of the water metaphors in my slides today. So maybe everyone, you can be the ripple, be the tide, be the tsunami, if you can bring positive changes to challenge the institutional like injustice and structure if you can, and to challenge like in daily life if you can. And then for the question about multiplicity and multiple dialogues, I think this is a really important point, and I very much agree with what Crain has said, because it is really vital to have like the open dialogues with different like actors, and this include perhaps also beyond so-called disciplinary borders or disciplinary areas, because I think some of the discussions we've been having today might be like really active in many disciplinary fields, but sometimes it will be really nice for people to come together and for those ideas to come together from different directions and to have this like open and equal dialogues across.
Thank you very much. The time has flown, unfortunately, and I think this is probably a good idea or good notion to stop on. There have been other questions that have been posted in the chat, so please, to the panelists, have a look at the questions. One question that has reached me is about, which I think it was a direct message, but it's about the specific levers of change that may be available to researchers in the global south and in the global north, that I think would make that link back to where Crain started us off with, the idea of another world is possible, a world that operates outside the confines of current patterns of dominance. So I think we only have 1 more minute at our disposal if there are any final thoughts that any of you would like to share.
In my case, if I can take this minute, I was just trying to have a dialogue with Victoria's question, because I think that diversity, multilingualism, all the tendencies that we have to boost in order to change the global standards that have been very harmful for science in some way, because we need more to think on the social relevance of science and knowledge than on bibliometrics and indicators and all those things. And I think that the movement of open science is giving us a great opportunity, but it is full of tensions. You can have an open science that is extracting more data from the peripheries and more global division of labor, as Raewyn said, or you can have an open science that is led by a non-commercial direction. I'm working for that. I think that we can all work in that direction, and I think that we're having there an opportunity for this.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Shin or Crain? Okay. Well, thank you so much to all of the panelists for a session that has raised a lot of questions, as well as prompting us to think about alternatives, a kind of imaginative and constructive possibilities for the future. So thinking equally about moving beyond current patterns of dominance, but also ways of disrupting current situations, and also thinking creatively about possibilities for knowledge sharing. So thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for your questions and comments. And I'm going to invite now Simon, I think, to wrap up the day and connect us to the agenda for tomorrow.
Well, thank you, Alice, and thank you, panel, for such an interesting session. Our theme of the conference is higher education knowledge for a plural world, and we find ourselves immediately saying, well, we need more plural approach to knowledge, and that was, of course, what happened in that session, and that theme will continue tomorrow and to the end of the conference. I want to thank and congratulate everyone for such a good first day. We've had successively 193, 159, 161, 166, 141, and in the last session, 99. Perhaps if one person had gone out of the room and dialed in on their phone as well, we would have reached 100 for all of our sessions. We had brilliant keynotes, 2 brilliant keynotes today, which drew a lot of very positive feedback, and will repay watching again on YouTube, as all the sessions will. I want to thank our chairs, successively Paul, Yanya, Vincent, David, Ellen, and Alice, and also, and perhaps most of all, Trevor Trehan, who anchors this whole process, is there in every session, manages all the connections, often gets the slides moving. And I also want to thank Cully Brownbridge, who has played a significant role in shaping up this conference as well. Tomorrow we move to 9 o'clock again, and we will have with us in the opening keynote and the Burton R. Clark lecture on higher education, Peter Scott. Peter Scott, one of the 2 most, I guess, most sage-like experts on higher education in the UK. The other one, of course, being Michael Shattock, and none of us would want to choose between the 2. Their contributions have been immense, and Peter will give the Burton R. Clark, as Mike did 2 years ago, tomorrow. We're also going to discuss immediately after that coloniality and racism, and Shin will be with us again, chairing that session, where we've got Sharon Stein, Riyad Shah Jahan, Solomon Zwalde, and David Mills, tremendous panel. And then after that, we will look at alternate views of higher education and the economy with Stephanie Elias from South Africa, James Robson, Phil Brown, and Nicola Ingram. Again, a really strong panel. In the afternoon, we'll have reports, discussions in relation to the 10 active CG projects. And the final session will be Kerry Face's keynote on higher education and sustainability. So a very good day coming up tomorrow. I hope everyone will come back for that and bring your friends. Let's see if we can have no more 99s. And thank you all for staying to the end today. Bye for now.